Have been placed on a listen-only mode until the question-answer segment of today's conference. If you would like to ask a question, that will be star one on your touch-tone phone. Today's call is also being recorded. If you should have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to Sarah Brunell. Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you very much, and on behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to the May Advanced Topics in Implementation Science webinar. Today we are so very delighted to welcome our presenter, Sharon Strauss with St. Michael's Hospital and the University of Toronto. She'll be joined by our own Dr. David Chambers, who will be moderating the session. A very brief word about logistics and we'll be off. As the operator said, questions are encouraged, and there are two ways you can ask your question at the end of the session. You can press star one to ask your question on the phone live, and you'll be placed in the queue to do so. Or you can type your question in at the Q&A tab at the top of your screen and hit Ask to submit the question. You can submit your question at any time, but we'll be opening the session for questions when all speakers have finished. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the meeting over to Dr. David Chambers.
Thanks, Sarah, and it's great to have everyone with us. As some of you may know, in recent months, we've had a series of webinars where we've been unpacking commonly used frameworks in dissemination implementation research and having a chance for the developers of those frameworks to spend some time walking through their development and then give examples of how they've been used in different projects, both on the research and the program side of it. We think that that's been a nice way to go beyond what we've been doing in the past, which has provided an overview of the many, many different frameworks, but without sufficient opportunity to really dive into what was the thinking behind their creation and how can they best be used. Again, the point of this is to make it easier for our researchers, for our practitioners, for our policymakers to get a good sense of the theoretical basis of implementation science and to think about how some of these different models might find root in helping to drive some of their projects, to explain some of the research questions that they're asking and really move the field forward. We're also just particularly lucky today to have a leader not only around different frameworks, but really in the broader field of dissemination implementation research or implementation science as we think about it in the U.S. or knowledge translation as folks think about it in other countries. Sharon Strauss has been one of these wonderful people who's spanned so many different boundaries. We often do get into our sort of word salad of what are the key terms that we think best represent the research challenges that we're trying to undertake. And I think Sharon has been one who, whether it's time spent within the UK, a lot of the work that she's done around knowledge translation in Canada, or some of the partnerships that we've been able to foster in training folks within the US, I think Sharon has, with incredible fluency, been able to bridge the different terms, the different gaps, the different settings, and has become and has been for a while a global leader in thinking about these challenges of how do we take research and translate it to the benefit of patients, of systems, and of policy. Sharon comes to us not only as a researcher but a geriatrician, so her ability to transcend research, practice, and policy is not only something that she studies, but something that she puts into practice daily. So not to take up any more of her time, but to encourage Sharon to share with us just some of her expertise and then to turn it over to the group for question and answers. Just want to give Sharon a hearty welcome and appreciate your spending the time to walk through the knowledge to action cycle with us today. So Sharon, you want to take it away?
Yep, great. Thanks so much, David. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks, Sarah, as well, for organizing this. And it's great to have this opportunity to come and chat with people. And in particular, I was asked to talk about the knowledge to action framework. Before I start, I'll just declare my competing interests that I was involved with the development of the framework. In terms of other things to keep in mind as I'm going through my slides, I do a lot of work with different journals. And some of that I'll refer to a little bit, but just so that you have that in mind. So moving along then to the session for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the knowledge to action framework, in particular how it was developed and how it could be used and where I see some of the challenges are, and in particular highlighting some of the research gaps that I see that could potentially be addressed by people if they're interested. So thinking about this slide really looks at kind of what the knowledge to action cycle is, and it was created with colleagues including Ian Graham, who's at the University of Ottawa, and it was based on a systematic review of the theories of planned action. And when you look at all the theories of planned action and we put them all together, there were certain key elements that came out, and those really form the action cycle, which are the steps along the outside. One of the things that we found that was kind of interesting is that a lot of the theories on planned action didn't specifically talk about the knowledge piece, and we felt that was an important piece to include in the knowledge to action framework, because you can't really do any implementation without thinking about the knowledge about research evidence that you're trying to implement. So that's why you see in this center we put that knowledge creation aspect. Within that center, though, the idea is that it's a funnel. And so it starts off with, you can see the knowledge inquiry, where we do those primary research projects to do the original research on whatever topic it might be. Then that's followed by a synthesis, where we look at the totality of the evidence on a particular topic. So not taking the results of a single small study for implementation, but looking at the body of evidence on that particular topic. Then thinking about taking that knowledge synthesis and creating different knowledge products or tools, and these could be things like a patient decision aid or a clinical practice guideline or a policy brief for policymakers. So the idea is to take that synthesized evidence and to create a tool that could be used then to disseminate and implement, where that's tailored to the end user. So whether that's a patient or a clinician or a policymaker. And then on the outside, then we have the action cycle. And that goes from, at the very bottom, you can see where it talks about identifying the gap, all the way around to sustaining knowledge use. And you can see that there's arrows going in both directions. And that's to highlight that, as with any implementation project, sometimes we maybe move forward in the cycle, but we may encounter a challenge, or we may see, for example, maybe our intervention initially is working, but after a year, maybe it stops working, and we have to go back into the cycle to understand maybe there's new barriers that have come up into play within the healthcare system. So it really is very much about being an iterative process, where sometimes you do have to go back and forth in the cycle. So then one of the things to keep in mind, and I apologize, that's going to be the only animation you're going to see on my slide today, but that's to highlight that the evidence has to inform each step in the knowledge and implementation process. Because we have to look at what's the evidence out there, for example, on adapting the knowledge to the local context. So what's the evidence around what's going on within that particular context for implementation? Similarly, what's the evidence on barriers to knowledge use? There's a lot of work that's been done by many people around the world on assessing barriers. And so how can we pull out that evidence and see what's relevant to our particular project that we're doing? So at each step along the way, really looking to the literature to see what evidence is potentially relevant to inform our implementation strategy. So that's kind of the overview of the cycle, and I'll go through the different steps. One of the things, if people haven't seen the paper by Milton that came out in April on implementation science, it's a nice overview of implementation theories, models, and frameworks. And he talked about, what's a theory, what's a framework, and what's a model. And I know with my PhD students, this is, the laugh when they hear this, because we always ask them, one of the first questions is, what's a theory, what's a framework, what's a model, and what's the difference across all these three. And so he does a nice job explaining this, but also because there are so many different theories and frameworks and models, he presents a nice overview. And he does describe the knowledge to action cycle really as a process framework, and that's exactly how I see it as well, that it's a framework. It's informing efforts on implementation, if you're really focused on kind of the doing of the implementation, but you can also use it to advance the science of implementation. And it's helpful to identify where the gaps are from a research perspective as well. So I really see it as a framework, and it's not a theory. So thinking about the different steps then, so I mentioned looking at the gap, and so figuring out, is the evidence being used in decision making or not? And that kind of starts our process to figure out what's the current state. And again, the strategy depends on the type of data we have available, the resources that we have available. This can be subjectively measured or objectively measured. Because it could be things like, is it knowledge that we're interested in assessing? Is it a skill set? Is it attitudes? Or is it a patient outcome, for example? So do we want to look to see what's the gap in a clinical care, for example, that's leading to a difference in patient outcomes? So it really starts off with having a good understanding of that gap and how big that gap is. Because if we're going to do an implementation strategy, we want to make sure that, we do have an understanding of what current practice is and have a good understanding of what our baseline is. So as I mentioned, there could be many different ways that we could measure this gap, and it depends on what data is available, obviously, what we have access to, what resources we have available. Some of the work that we've done, for example, we can do things like where we'll do chart audits. So we'll look at patients' charts, for example, and do direct data abstraction from the charts, and whether it's paper charts or electronic charts, we can do that. But with any of these strategies, there's going to be pros and cons to that form of data collection, and so we have to be aware of that. And so, for example, we recently did a study where we looked at the implementation of an early mobilization initiative for older adults admitted to hospital. And mobilization is not something that's routinely reported for patients when they get admitted to hospital. And so we had to come up with a way of assessing that. And part of that was looking at doing chart audit to see what people report in terms of mobility. And part of it was doing something called a chart-stimulated recall. And a chart-stimulated recall is where you use the chart from a patient, for example, and you engage the clinician who looked after the patient as well as the patient and use that to stimulate their recall around a particular decision, for example, or a particular clinical encounter. Because you can get a different type of information and a richer level of information and more detail sometimes than what you might get just by relying on what's recorded in the chart itself. So there's different strategies like that we can use to help understand what the current situation is with whatever the context is that we're interested in, whether this is at the patient level or the provider level, the policy level. It's really matching the need with the data that's available. So, for example, in Canada, we have a lot of access to administrative data around whenever a patient gets admitted to hospital. We have that data available provincially. We have their diagnosis. We have what physicians they saw, medication use, and so we can collect that information. That's quite helpful for us to be able to access. But it doesn't necessarily include all the information that we might want on particular patient populations. So it's what else are we going to have to collect? So that's, I think, one of the big issues when we're thinking about measuring the gap is understanding what it is that we want to do and what data we're going to need. And then secondly is what gap should be tackled. This is one of the things that I find really quite challenging in the healthcare field is that there's lots of different potential issues we could tackle. And I'm sure if we went around and asked each one of you on the line today, you could all tell me about different gaps in our healthcare systems around the world that we could potentially tackle. But we can't do everything, and one of the things that I think we have to be explicit about is to try and prioritize. And so then as part of the discussion around the knowledge action cycle, we really do try and get people to start thinking about how are they going to target the gaps that they want to address, and then putting some thought into prioritizing that. And really thinking about making sure that we have an understanding that there is evidence that exists that could be implemented, because we shouldn't be embarking on a very elaborate implementation strategy if there's not robust evidence to implement. And so that's, I think, one of the pieces that we're trying to advocate with the knowledge action framework. The second step in the knowledge action framework looks at adapting the knowledge to the local context. And this really speaks to the issue around that people are often concerned that you can't just take evidence from a systematic review of randomized trials, for example, and plug it into every setting and expect that it's going to work in exactly the same way. And it's really being able to understand what the context is in which we're going to be doing implementation work, and whether that's at the policy level, so understanding what's going on within a various government organization or at a healthcare organization or at a community setting, but really understanding what that context is in which we're going to be doing the implementation, and then adapting the evidence to that local context. I think one of the challenges in this area is that you can't lose sight of the rigor of the evidence, and so that you don't want to stray too far from what the evidence is suggesting, but do it within the limits of what's available in the evidence, and really focusing on how you could adapt it to your particular environment. And there's a couple of different approaches to this that we've used, and in particular things that Mark Harrison has developed as part of the ADAPT and the CAN Implement group. So very much focused on understanding the context and using different tools to assess the context, and then using that to modify your evidence that you're going to be implementing. This is something, if anybody is interested, a tool that our team developed in particular to assess the organizational readiness to implement something. One of the challenges that we found when we do any implementation projects is that, a hospital CEO, for example, could say, yes, we're really on board with this. We want to do, the delirium prevention strategy or the early mobilization strategy. But no matter what, everything trickles down to the frontline workers. And so the hospital CEO may say that, they're ready to go, but, the frontline workers are the ones that are going to be implementing it and have to be engaged. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is try to support teams who are trying to do implementation, create different tools and test tools that we use in our own implementation strategies that make them available. And this is a tool that we're just testing right now, where we took the systematic review that Marie-Pierre Gagnon did on different tools for assessing organizational readiness to change. We picked out the tools that had been shown to be valid, and then we created an algorithm for people to use to then help them decide which tool they should use in their particular setting. And so this is like a decision support tool for people to assess organizational readiness to change. And if anybody's interested, it's freely accessible. You can use it, test it. We're testing it right now in a randomized trial, and if anybody else is interested in it, please feel free to use it. The next piece then is understanding what the determinants to knowledge use are, so understanding the barriers and facilitators. And the barriers and facilitators at each level and each stakeholder group within the healthcare system. So, for example, we could think about it at the clinician level, or we could think about it at the patient level, at the policymaker, at the healthcare manager level. And as you all know, usually when we're trying to do any implementation work, we have to think about barriers and facilitators at all of those different levels, because typically we do implementation work that's going to target multiple stakeholders within the healthcare system. And as you're all aware, there are different tools that we can use to assess barriers to implementation. And one of the frameworks that we use a lot is we use the theoretical domains framework, and we use that to inform our interview guides. And then we do interviews and focus groups with our stakeholders to identify what are the key determinants of the use of the evidence, and use that then to subsequent steps to map out our interventions. As you're all aware of, there are different reviews that people have done of barriers, and one of the classics is the one that Cabana and colleagues did, where they looked at the barriers to implementing guidelines just at the level of the physician, and more than 290 barriers were identified just at the physician level. And so I often say to my team, when you think about it, if anything gets implemented well and is sustained, it's almost a miracle, because if you think about all the different things that have to work to be able to do implementation well. So I think that while not to sound really depressing about this, I think this is kind of where the implementation gets to be quite a lot of fun, because it's really figuring out what the key barriers are, because we're not going to be able to address all of the barriers that we identify, but what are the key barriers that we need to address to facilitate implementation, and then also thinking about what the facilitators are. And in particular, I think sometimes we forget about what the facilitators might be. So then moving on in the knowledge to action cycle, once we've identified the barriers and facilitators, we map those out against the evidence around what we know works with regards to changing behavior. And so it's really about bringing the art and the science together to select and tailor and implement the KTA intervention. And And I apologize for that. I tend to use the words knowledge translation instead of dissemination and implementation because our funding agency in Canada, the CIHR, uses that term. But whenever you hear knowledge translation, just in your mind, replace it with dissemination and implementation. Or if you're listening in the UK, think about it as implementation science. So it's really thinking about, in this case, it's mapping out the intervention based on what we understand from our context assessment and the barriers and facilitators. And one of the things, this is an area that I see from a research perspective that more work needs to be done on really understanding how to optimize the implementation interventions. If you look at the literature on this topic, we could think about our interventions could be theory-driven, they could be empirically driven, or they could be really exploratory. And they could be single components, they could be multiple components, and similarly, they can target different stakeholder groups. So this is, again, I think where it gets to be quite a lot of fun, but also can be kind of challenging to think about how we're going to develop this intervention. And really what we're trying to think about is encourage people to use theory and evidence to inform the development of the intervention and think about what are the different barriers that we're trying to overcome and map those out to develop an evidence. One of the classic kind of systematic reviews in this area, as all of you I'm sure are aware, is the systematic review that was done more than 10 years ago now by Jeremy Grimshaw, where he looked at the different randomized trials for guideline implementation. And there was more than 235 studies that were done. And a couple of the key points I think that are important to keep in mind are, one is that very few studies used theory to inform the development of the intervention, and very few of them used evidence to inform the development of the intervention. And so it highlighted to me that we're not doing a very good job in the KTA or DNI fields to use the evidence that's already out there and to build on that and really advance the science in a thoughtful way. So I think it really has highlighted that we need to look back and see what interventions work or don't work and use that to inform the development of our intervention. Similarly, the other thing I thought was quite striking about the systematic review was that of all of these trials, as I mentioned, more than 235 randomized trials of guideline-based interventions, there was only 4 guidelines that were explicitly evidence-based. So I think it's also a good kind of thing to keep in mind that not all guidelines are created equally. So we always want to make sure that when we are doing any implementation work that we identify the guidelines that are high quality. So if we think about the evidence for KT interventions, overall, on average, any of the interventions targeting healthcare professionals change behavior by about 10%. So these are things like audit and feedback or reminder systems, academic detailing, they can change behavior by about 10%. And I know when I speak to my, my hospital board and things, and they all think 10% doesn't seem that exciting or that impressive. But I think overall, you have to focus on, this is a place to start, and our subsequent interventions can build on that. And it cannot, and that 10% absolute change is quite impressive in a lot of areas. So I think that I think we have to be encouraged by that. Similarly, we can think about organizational interventions, and again, there's a body of evidence on this, and I'll talk a little bit about where some of these resources are that we can use to access the evidence on this, patient-directed interventions and financial interventions. So it's really thinking about what's the evidence on what works and what doesn't work, and building on that body of evidence to advance the field. The next step in the knowledge to action cycle is measuring the impact of knowledge use. So looking at whether the knowledge is really being used. And again, thinking about how we're going to measure this depends on what it is that we're trying to achieve. And there's different types of knowledge use because for example, there's very concrete knowledge use. If I'm trying to do something where I want to increase use of warfarin, which is an oral anticoagulant in patients with atrial fibrillation, which is an irregular heartbeat, I can look then at very concrete knowledge use. So is the warfarin being prescribed? And I could capture warfarin prescriptions. That's the concrete use of knowledge. But sometimes we're not necessarily interested in that type of knowledge use. Maybe we're trying to look at providers' attitudes about evidence, for example, and maybe we're trying to change that. And so then we would measure that in a different way. And similarly, sometimes we talk about symbolic knowledge use, and sometimes people talk about this as knowledge as ammunition. So I think one of the things to keep in mind as we're trying to develop our evaluation strategy is thinking about what type of knowledge is it, and how are we going to measure that knowledge uptake or knowledge use. And then depending on that, then we're going to develop our different data collection strategies. So for example, if I'm thinking about prescribing warfarin, measuring that is very different from measuring attitudes about evidence. So the next step then is evaluating the impact of knowledge use. And I think this is sometimes where we get a little bit stuck, because a lot of times we think about that, yes, we have evidence that something works. So for example, going back to the strategy I was talking about with early mobilization, we know we've got systematic reviews showing that if we mobilize older people when they come into hospital, it's a good thing. We can decrease their length of stay, we can decrease their delirium, we can decrease their depression, we can decrease hospital costs, so it's a good thing. What we don't know about is whether or not my implementation strategy to get people to use that early mobilization strategy is effective. And so that highlights the importance then of doing the evaluation piece. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to do it as a randomized trial, but I do think that we have not necessarily been as thoughtful in the knowledge translation field around the rigor of evaluation. And thinking about both the quantitative and the qualitative. So from a quantitative perspective, we could think about doing a randomized trial or an interrupted time series. But the qualitative piece, I think, is so important as well, because it really helps us understand, I talk about the dose and the formulation. So similar to a drug study, with an implementation intervention, it's figuring out what that dose of the intervention is, what the formulation is, and what the key active ingredients are, so that then that can inform others who might be interested. And this is, again, an area that I think makes implementation science really fun and interesting, because it requires researchers who've got different skill sets to come together and to try and answer the questions. And then the next step in the knowledge action cycle focuses on sustaining and scaling up knowledge use, and again requires ongoing monitoring of the intervention and of the outcomes. And sometimes, as you all know, we might have periods of time where we see the intervention is working and we're seeing the outcomes in the direction that we wanted, but all of a sudden maybe something has changed in the system. And so, for example, we did a delirium prevention strategy in a hospital setting, and we found that initially the delirium prevention strategy resulted in almost a 50% reduction in delirium in patients with hip fractures. But then we noticed that over the next 6 months, the rate started going up again. And it required us then to look back and see, well, what was going on over that period, and how do we adjust the intervention. And so one of the things that we found was that the local champions on the orthopedic wards, which is where we were targeting this, had done such a great job on this implementation initiative that the hospital wanted them moved to another unit to try and encourage implementation on another site. And so unfortunately then what happened, we lost our local champions. And so then it really highlighted about how you need to kind of keep track of your implementation strategy, and if you find that maybe the intervention isn't working after a while, you need to go back into the cycle to understand maybe there's new barriers that have come into play. Similarly, at the health system level, we recently last year went through a mass exodus from our Ministry of Health because we had an election, and that impacted one of our implementation projects that was going on. And so then it requires that ongoing engagement with the relevant end users to make sure that we have an understanding of what's going on in the system, and that we can modify our implementation strategy if we have to. There are some reviews that I found helpful to help us think about sustainability, and so there was one that was published in Implementation Science a couple of years ago, really highlighting that, again, a gap in this area and not as much work being done in this area as maybe we would like to see. And highlighting how few studies really go beyond 2 or 3 years to look at the sustainability issue. Similarly, Russell Gruen did a nice paper in The Lancet a few years ago where he looked at the sustainability of health system programs. And he used these to develop a model to try and help inform people if they're trying to think about developing a sustainability, in particular of a health system program. And looking at things like what's the health issue that you're trying to tackle, the elements of the program and the drivers of the program, both within a particular setting as well as external factors, including resources, both within a system as well as at the policy level, for example. Those are a couple of useful resources that we found to help inform what we do. And then they've also provided some different models of sustainability that are available. As you all know, a lot of models have been created. Not as many have really been tested and shown to be valid. And there's a nice paper that explains some of these as well. Similarly with the scalability, we put the scalability and the sustainability together and use the same framework. And in particular, the scalability framework is from the NHS model for sustainability. And it's thinking about what's the goal, what are the innovation characteristics, what's the context, what interventions are effective, and how do we measure impact. So it's really thinking about not just sustaining it, but if we found it to be effective, we want to scale it up. What's an approach to thinking about this? This is something, again, that if you look at the literature, there's not as much literature on understanding how to scale up strategies, and especially how you scale them up across different settings. So, for example, scaling things up across different low and middle income countries if we're trying to optimize maternal and infant health. This is something that we're working on right now in a project with the WHO, and which you're probably wondering, why is a geriatrician working on maternal and infant health? But it's the same method. It's just a different clinical area. And one of the things that I think is really important, if people are interested in looking at kind of gaps, if there are any trainees involved with this call today, this is an area that I see as being of future relevance, and there's not a lot of work being done in this area. Then people always want to know, like, is the knowledge to action framework being used at all? And there was a citation analysis and systematic review that was published last year in Implementation Science, and they found that 146 studies reported using it since it was first published in 2006. We modified it a little bit 2 years ago. It was just kind of a slight modification, but didn't really change any of the steps, just made things a little bit more explicit. And one of the things that I don't think any of you would be surprised about is that while lots of studies report it being used, far fewer studies report that they actually use it throughout their process, from design through to delivery and evaluation. And this is, I think, common to a lot of work that's being done around theories and frameworks, that people might mention that they're using this framework, but is it explicitly used throughout the process? Is it used beyond, for example, the time when we submit the grant and we say that we're using it to frame the grant? Do people then really use it to develop the implementation strategy and the evaluation? And I think this kind of highlights a gap in the area. The other thing with this is that, 10 studies reported that it was integral to the design and delivery of their project. This is based on what they reported. And so the question is whether, if we've gone back to the authors of the 146 studies, would they be, would more than 10 of them have said yes, they used it throughout the process? So I don't know. We'd have to do that. But again, there's one potential project. And then who was using this? So and what targets? And so you can see here that the studies involve patients, public, and clinicians. So there wasn't a lot of studies using this for the policy domain. We've used it with policymakers, but I know others feel that maybe it's not as applicable in the policy domain, since some of the steps really are focused on explicit use of the evidence and being able to translate that into outcomes. And so at the policy level, sometimes people said, well, maybe that's not as easy to do or as relevant. So that's one thing I think to consider if anybody is thinking about working in the policy domain. The last thing that I just wanted to focus on is what I see are the challenges, and in particular with KT, and just to be cautious of. So first of all, the thing to focus on is the lack of knowledge is not the most significant barrier. I think we spend a lot of time thinking that the knowledge, and if people just had the evidence, then things would happen. And in fact, we know there are so many other barriers within the healthcare system, and lack of time is one of the key things, certainly at a clinical level that we face. But I think no matter who we're targeting within the healthcare system, lack of time is going to be a big issue. And so it's really taking that time to understand that we have to explore what the barriers and facilitators are. The second challenge that I see is clinicians should not be the only target for implementation research or practice of implementation. A lot of the work that's been done, if you look at the systematic reviews that have been done, if you look at things like the HbAlc, a lot of the interventions really are targeting clinicians. But in fact, we are only one component within the healthcare system. And one of the things that we've been doing over the last few years is look at strategies that are targeting different types of patient outcomes and complex interventions. And so this is a systematic review that was published in The Lancet a couple of years ago that was led by my team. And Andrea Trico, who's a researcher on my team, led us on this project to look at KT and QI interventions for diabetes management. And the idea behind this slide is really to focus on the interventions that are most effective are not the ones that are targeting the clinician. So you can see that the biggest effect sizes are these ones up here. So the ones that are furthest to the right, biggest effect sizes, these are the ones that are promoting things that are targeting either the patients or the team. We started to see this now. We saw this in diabetes. We've seen it now in another review that we did for frequent users of the healthcare system. We saw the same thing, and a third one around falls prevention strategies. So really focusing on identifying interventions that are targeting the patients and the team rather than just the clinicians, and that we're going to see bigger effect sizes. Similarly, multi-component interventions may not be more effective than single-component interventions. This is one of the bottom lines that Jeremy identified in his systematic review that I think everybody was quite shocked by. But I think one of the things that Michelle Vensing has done really nicely is point out that some of these multi-component interventions targeted a single barrier. So, for example, if you did an intervention targeting healthcare professionals that included lectures, educational materials, and a workshop, it's a multi-component intervention that there was different formats of education, but they really only addressed one barrier, which was lack of knowledge. And so they had a single or multi-component intervention. And so that was one of the challenges, I think, in the systematic review that Jeremy did, is really kind of classifying what's a single component, what's a multi-component, did they address different barriers or not. So Michelle Vensing, as I said, has done some nice work in this area, really looking at helping us understand that a little bit better. Then the fourth one is beware that it seemed like a good idea at the time. And this is something that Martin Eccles has written about, where rather than throwing a bunch of things together and when we're developing our intervention is really being thoughtful about what might work and using theory as well as evidence to inform the development of the intervention. And this is where I said that I think that, from a KT science perspective, I think we could do a much better job advancing our understanding of how to optimize the interventions by really using the evidence that's out there and building on it. And so if people haven't seen, this is the RX for Change database. It's a freely accessible database that provides critical appraisals of the interventions that we're all interested in from an implementation perspective. So it includes critical appraisals, for example, of systematic reviews of audit and feedback, of educational outreach. So they're all categorized according to who the target is, so whether it's a healthcare provider, consumer, organizational, financial, or regulatory, and it gives critical appraisal of the systematic review. So it allows us easy access to the evidence base that we can use to inform the development of our interventions. And then this is a resource, again, that's freely available that Brian Haynes created, which if you want articles pushed at you that are relevant to implementation, so the dissemination implementation, you can sign up for this and have the articles pushed at you. He's got a team of people at McMaster who read the top 140 journals around the world, and they identify the articles that are relevant and newsworthy. And so those, and if you register for this, it's free. You just have to provide your email address, and then they will email you with the articles that come out, and you can have them sent to you once a week if you want, or once a month, however often you want it. And then finally, not to leave sustainability until the end. I think a lot of times we've seen our projects, we spend so much time up front thinking about the implementation strategy and less time thinking about sustainability. And certainly Trish Greenhall and her work have highlighted how seldom we think about sustainability of our implementation strategies. And so I think this is an area that we really need to focus on at the beginning. And certainly from an academic perspective, thinking about how we can advance the science of this and meet the needs of our different users from a policy perspective as well as from a clinical perspective. So having said that, I'm just going to end with beware the KTA imperative. So we don't need to do these elaborate implementation strategies for every piece of research, but be thoughtful about what we're going to target for activities. The last few slides I've left in the deck if anybody's interested to see examples of how we've used the knowledge to action framework. And with that, I'm going to end there and hand it back to David.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I'm actually just going to pop in with a quick logistical note to remind folks that we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. You can submit your questions two different ways. You can press *1 to ask your question live on the line, or you can use the Q&A feature at the top of your screen for those of you on live meeting. So you can type your question in the provided field and hit ask.
And so while folks are contemplating what questions to think about, Sharon, I do wonder if I see that you did have a couple of examples. Can you walk through one just so people get a sense of how the framework has been used? Is that, like the FORCE study, I guess, is the first one, or whichever you want. But I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. So I'll give as an example the FORCE study. So the FORCE study was a project that we did in Northern Ontario. So this was a project that was identified by the local group. So it was a group of public health providers as well as clinicians and patient advocates, because they noticed a problem that they were having people coming back to hospital again and again, older adults with falls and fractures. And so they wanted to know, is there something that they could do to address these? They called them their frequent fallers. And we had national guidelines on managing osteoporosis, and we also have quite a lot of evidence on managing falls. And so they wanted to see what could we potentially do. So we had a group of, we engaged primary care clinicians, we had pharmacists, rehab therapists, and we did a local study showing that less than 40% of these people get assessed for osteoporosis or falls risk. So these are the people who are coming into hospital with one or more fractures, and so this is the group that we really want to target for osteoporosis assessment and falls risk, and yet less than 40% of them were. So then we did that as our gap assessment, and then we looked at how do we understand what the context is, and how do we need to adapt the evidence. So we did focus groups using the theoretical domains framework. We set up focus groups and interviews with the clinicians, with patients, with the healthcare managers, with caregivers to really understand what the barriers to implementing the osteoporosis and falls prevention strategies were. And some of the key challenges that we found, for example, were this was in a smaller community in Northern Ontario. Not everybody had a primary care clinician, for example. The primary care clinicians identified that sometimes they had trouble referring patients who did have osteoporosis and maybe were more challenging to manage. They had a hard time referring them to the appropriate specialist. Or maybe they had a patient who had a bone mineral density, but they weren't sure necessarily how to interpret that, and so how to tailor the evidence to that particular patient. So that was very much about trying to understand what the barriers of facilitators were, and so based on that, then we mapped out the intervention to those different barriers and facilitators. And because, as I said, we didn't know, we know there's evidence around osteoporosis. We know if we treat people with osteoporosis, we can decrease their risk of fracture. And similarly, we had good evidence from falls prevention. What we didn't know is whether or not our intervention was going to work to try and implement that. So we did it as a randomized trial of a multi-component intervention. and where we looked at both falls and osteoporosis management. And we randomized 200 patients to either getting the intervention immediately or getting it at 6 months. And as I said, it was very much tailored to the context. And one of the things you'll see on this slide is that patients were 55 years or older. And people, if there's anybody on the call who kind of works with older populations, you might be surprised at this. But this highlighted how it was important to really understand the local context before we developed the intervention. Because one of the key things that we found when we did the baseline gap assessment and also the assessment of barriers and facilitators is that the frequent followers, there was a large percentage of them were younger, were 55 and older, as opposed to, my population that I typically see in downtown Toronto are, like the over 75 population. And so this really highlighted how we have to address the needs of this relatively young, older population, and so being able to contextualize it to the environment. And if we hadn't done that at the beginning, we would have missed this issue. So it really was important to have spent the time up front in that. Then, as I said, with the intervention, it was very much a multi-component intervention, and in this case, we had a nurse, and the team came up with they called the nurse the enforcer, because the study was called the FORCE study. And the nurse did various things like the balance scale, medication review, checked the patient for orthostatic hypotension, a BMD, so bone mineral density test. This is a barrier because not everybody had access to a BMD or thought to order it. So they were automatically ordered on patients who were at high risk, and then the results were sent to the primary care physician with relevant prescribing information based on the national guidelines. So they got not just the results of the BMD, but how to interpret it and how to individualize the evidence to that particular patient. And then similarly, the same information was given to the patient so that they had a copy of it and they could discuss it with their primary care clinician. It was very much about trying to map out the intervention to the barriers that we identified. So then at 6 months, we were able to see a doubling in the use of appropriate osteoporosis therapy. And then we saw it when we gave it to the delayed group, and we saw a similar increase. The number of falls in the intervention group was greater at 12 months, and this highlights why it's important to treat the osteoporosis, so increase fracture. And that's seen in fall studies that if we mobilize people, you do increase the chance that people might fall. So, but you want to make sure that you don't increase injurious falls, and you also want to appropriately treat their osteoporosis. So the other thing we looked at is quality of life, and quality of life was enhanced in our intervention group as well. So one of the pieces that we looked at, and as I mentioned, we did a qualitative piece to really understand what the active ingredients were. And one of the key things in this one was the self-management piece. And that was a piece of the intervention that was particularly effective. And so that led us on then to a project that one of my PhD students did at the time, Monika Kastner, where she developed then a tool that patients would use on their own, and it would give them individualized advice that they could then share with their clinician. And that kind of led to the next study that we finished not that long ago, where the patients were really very much the drivers of the initiative. So that's an example of kind of start to finish, but how then our process of going through the knowledge to action cycle then led to a second knowledge to action cycle to try and continue the refinement of the intervention.
Great, thanks so much. So I do see we have a question. First of all, commenting on your great presentation, so thank you, as we do. As you know, it is a challenge but worthy to pause an intervention, identify barriers to implementation, and then do the type of adaptation you suggest to overcome the barriers. Is this something that was built into the grants or study design initially? Was it difficult to get buy-in from the researchers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because that's one of the challenges, isn't it? That people are used to kind of having an intervention and sticking with that intervention regardless, and because that's the classic model of, so for example, a drug trial, isn't it, where we stick with the dosage and we're not going to change our intervention. And so I think it does take a bit of a different mindset, a different approach, to say that we are going to build in this flexibility around the intervention. And so, for example, with our With our mobilization study that I talked about, our early mobilization strategy, the way that I framed it in our grant when we got that one, and the subsequent grants around that project, was people committed to implementing the evidence. They committed to saying that we believe mobilization is important. We're going to assess every older patient over the age of 65 for mobility as soon as they come into hospital. They will get mobilized 3 or more times a day, and progressive scaled mobilization throughout their hospital stay. So the intervention was implementing those 3 key messages. And then how we said that we would do the intervention then is that we would use the framework that I talked about and that we would contextualize it to the environment so that each hospital didn't necessarily implement that evidence in exactly the same way. We did it in the same approach where we understood the context, we did the barriers and facilitator assessment, we mapped out the intervention, but this exact same intervention was not used across the site. And I think
sorry, go ahead, sure.
No, I was just saying, I think that it does require a little bit of a different approach to writing that, and sometimes reviewers don't always like that approach because we're not sticking with the same intervention.
Yeah, and it sounds like for people who might, on the line, who might be considering using it, to know the degree to which there might be sort of core components known about an intervention versus, as other models have termed, the sort of adaptable components of the intervention, the flexibility. It sounds like in that case you were able to take the advantage of the fact that there were some key messages, but there was a lot of flexibility in terms of how an intervention could be delivered.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we have another question which just asks whether there are settings or situations where the knowledge to action framework hasn't worked as well or doesn't seem to fit as well. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I think the key thing is that is around the policy perspective is that, and I talked to John Levis, who's one of our researchers in Canada who does a lot of work on the policy side of things. And I know that he's often touted about whether the knowledge to action cycle is optimal for the policy environment, because it is very much focused on assessing knowledge uptake and looking at impact on outcomes. And I think that sometimes that's a little bit harder to do from the policy perspective. But aside from that, I think certainly we've used it in a number of different settings. We've used it in a number of different initiatives. We used it in community settings. We've used it in low and middle income countries. As I mentioned, we've got an initiative focused on implementation of the WHO guidelines on maternal and infant health, and we've done it now. We've used this approach in, I think, 8 or 9 different countries now, and have found it to be something that can be applied regardless of the setting. So that's something. And we're just working on a series now for Journal Clinepi on using the model in those different settings. The other thing, if people are interested in, with Monika Kastner, we wrote a paper in Journal Clinepi about a year or 2 ago around integrating the knowledge to action framework with the MRC framework for developing and evaluating complex interventions. And we walked through an example of how we use that for the osteoporosis, the self-management project that we talked about. And so if that's of interest, people might want to have a look at that. Similarly, we've done it for, we've got a paper coming out. We developed a different type of format of a systematic review. One of my PhD students, Laura Perrier, did this for her PhD. And again, was an example of integrating the knowledge action cycle with the MRC framework and taking that through as an example throughout, from developing the intervention to doing a randomized trial with clinicians to see if the new format of a systematic review increased their ability to use the evidence on a patient.
And Sharon, with that, I want to go ahead and jump in, just to be cognizant of time, and say thank you so much to both you and David for your time this afternoon, and to let folks on the line know that your feedback is important to us, and we encourage you to complete our online evaluation. A link to the survey will be sent to you in an email shortly. And as mentioned, we would like to continue this discussion from the webinar online at researchtriality.cancer.gov, where you can engage with the speakers and other participants through discussion posts and forums. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your time.